Hello everyone, welcome back to Strategic Management class. In this video, we are in the second part of the external analysis. In the previous part, we already discussed about pastel analysis. Now we will discuss about Porter's 5 forces analysis, which counts for a tool to analyze the industry forces. So, for the Porter 5 forces, obviously there are 5 of the forces. There is bargaining power of buyers or customers, and then the bargaining power of suppliers. There is threats of new entrants, and there is also threats of substitutes, which all influences the last force, which is the degree of competition. You can take a look at this diagram. Porter 5 forces actually has a new development, which is there is a 6th factor, which is a complementary product or service. We will discuss each of the forces one by one. Okay, we start with the first force, which is bargaining power of supplier. For bargaining power of supplier, what you need to consider is basically within the industry that your company or your business is operating, you need to consider who are your suppliers. You need to consider how many suppliers are there, so the number of suppliers, the size of the suppliers, their pricing, their uniqueness of services compared to each other, your own company's ability to substitute the supplier with another one, and also the cost of changing or switching from one supplier to another supplier. In this first force, we are trying to take a look at what is your power relatively towards your supplier. If your supplier has a bigger size compared to your company, and then the options of suppliers are also limited, it means that your supplier has more power over you. Whereas if your company is bigger, has a lot of customers, and buy a lot from a certain supplier, it means that you can negotiate more to your supplier. So this is the dynamic within the industry forces that you need to analyze. Which one has more power, and the leeway, or basically the allocation that you have to negotiate. The next force is bargaining power of buyers. Now, with the last one was supplier, this one is with buyer. Now, what you need to consider is basically the number of customers, the size of each order, the size of the market as well, the difference between competitors, the price sensitivity, ability to substitute, and also the cost of changing. In this force, what you need to consider is basically whether your customer has power over you or whether you have power over your customer. If your customer has power over your company, means that customer can pressure your company to lower the pricing. Whereas if your company has more power over your customer, it means that you are unique, you are differentiated, then customer has no choice but to buy from you. The next force is threats of new entrants. With the threats of new entrants, you're considering, is there any upcoming entrants in the industry? Is there any new company that can enter the industry easily? This means that if there are more companies in the industry, you have more competitors to compete with for the same amount of customers or the same amount of market size. Now, there are two things to be considered, which are barriers to entry and retaliation from current participants. Barriers to entry means that within the industry, is there any barrier or any limitation that can hinder new entrants to easily jump into the industry? Whereas retaliation from current participants means that the incumbent companies or the existing companies within the industry, do they have any actions, or are they likely to do anything to hinder or to block new competitors from entering their industry? So for barriers to entry, you need to consider specialist knowledge, product differentiation, capital requirements, access to distribution channels, cost advantage, technology protection, government policy, economies of scale, switching costs. Whereas for retaliation from current participants, what things to be considered is actually to maintain a high barrier of entry and customer loyalty as well, so that customers will still buy from the existing company rather than switching to a newer one. By the way, there are two vocabularies that I just casually mentioned, which probably you haven't heard about. The first one is economies of scale. Economies of scale is defined as something that is derived from incremental efficiency improvements as a company grows bigger. And when a company grows bigger, they can buy in a bulk, they can spread the risk, they can reduce the logistic costs, and there are many things that they can do in order to gain less risk and also to gain more profit or reduce the cost. Whereas the second vocabulary is switching cost. Switching cost means that what would be the cost of someone to switch to another supplier or buyer. Okay, so switching cost is not just something that is related to money, but it is also related to time and energy. A good example to explain about switching costs is, for example, like the Apple products. If you guys are already loyal and also using Apple products, you are more familiar with the Apple ecosystem. And when you're more familiar with that, it is less likely for you to switch to an Android device because you don't get the benefit of the ecosystem anymore. It costs you money. It also costs you time and effort to move all of the data. So this is considered or called as switching cost. Okay, let's move on to the next force, which is called threats of substitute. As I mentioned earlier, substitute is basically another product or service that can substitute your company's offering. So what you need to think about the threats of substitute is basically identify what are they and which company, and also what would be the cost of change. And finally, the final force is the degree of competition. The degree of competition to be considered is how many competitors are there within the industry, and then the quality differences among each companies, and then is there any other differences? Is there any switching cost between your company and your competitors? Is your customer loyal? Or are their customer loyal, which means they are not going to move to your company or not going to buy from your company? And then think also about exit barriers. Now, exit barriers actually is the opposite of entry barriers or barriers to entry, which exit barriers is basically something that hinders companies to continue to compete in an industry even though the returns are low or negative. It means that if your company is actually making a loss in the industry, it's hard for you to close down the company and call it quits. So what things need to be considered with exit barriers are, is there any specialized assets? Is there any fixed cost of exit? Is there any strategic interrelationships among companies? Is there any emotional barriers? Is there any government and social restrictions that hinder you from exiting the industry? So the more difficult it is to exit an industry, it is hard for companies to actually liquidate their business if anything goes wrong. Special edition for you guys, which is the sixth force of Porter's forces, is called the complementary product. What you need to think about this is basically Is there any product or service that can complement what your company is offering so that you can collaborate together in order to increase your sales and finally your profit? All right, we are done with the Porter's 5 forces. Let's move on to the final tool, which is competitor analysis. It is very simple. It is also known as benchmarking, if some of you have heard about it. So with the competitor analysis, you can take a look at this diagram. Basically, what you're trying to identify are these 5 things, which is you want to try to identify what are the future objectives of your competitors, and then you're trying to identify what are their current strategies. Try to identify what are their assumptions at the moment, assumptions about themselves, assumptions about you, and assumptions about the industry and the competition to win the market. And then also identify what would be their capabilities, and all the 4 factors over there will be combined into try to figure out what are the response that they will do. It means that what would be the actions of your competitors in the near future within the industry. Usually, competitor analysis is just qualitative analysis. You do benchmarking, you do observation, you do your research, and that's it. But in this class, we try to learn about how to quantify your competitor analysis. Take a look at this table. You can see there are several components. Everything is numbers. The first one, you need to identify critical success factors, meaning that you need to identify what factors that can help a company, your company, and also your competitors to become successful. And these factors should be something that is important for the companies that is operating within the same industry. And once you list that, you can also list which company you want to compare with. For example, your own company and several competitors. So you can list under company 1, 2, and 3. And the next one, you need to assign weight. Weight means that you assign the degree of importance for each critical success factors. So you need to assign from the most important to the least important, as long as everything equals to 1 or 100%. Which means that the most important factor will have the highest weight, and vice versa. For the lowest number or the lowest weight would be the least important factor for the success of the company. And then after that, you can do your observations, you can do your research about yourself and your competitors, and put rating for each critical success factors. For the rating, it ranges from number 1 until number 4. Number 1 being major weakness, number 2 is minor weakness, number 3 is minor strength, number 4 is major strength. And then multiply the rating and the weight for each critical success factor. You do that for everything, and you total or sum up the score for each company, and you can try to compare your company from your competitors using numbers. All right, to wrap up the external analysis, we have learned about pastel analysis to analyze the macro environment. After that, you can use the Porter's 5 forces to analyze deeper about the industry. And finally, you can analyze the competitors to compare yourself with your competitors. That is all. Salam entrepreneur.